Hello horror hounds, and welcome back to my A to Z of horror, where it is time for some tea and a film that was released in the US as Horror on Snape Island, Potter, and shamelessly re-released as Beyond the Fog to try and piggyback on the success of John Carpenter's meteorological movie. Tea is a 1972 British horror film called Tower of Evil. Right about now, regular viewers are wondering, yeah, but Andrew, your A to Z of horror is all well and good, but we know that Jambo Shango and Randy Mole did one way before you. And what's their entry for tea? I'm going to link in the description field below to their review of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Mwah! But for now, let us deal with the horror on Snape Island and Tower of Evil. On Snape Island, a small rocky promontory with a lighthouse on it off the English coast, a series of bizarre and brutal murders have taken place. One of the victims was killed with an ancient Phoenician artifact that has no business being anywhere near the British Isles. So a team of archaeologists are sent to the island to search for a cache of treasure that might rewrite the history books, believing that a Phoenician king was buried along with his treasure on Snape Island. But instead, they find a horrific mystery when someone or something begins to kill them off one by one. The opening of the movie really is quite something. It is as if extras from a Hammer film stumble upon the aftermath of a Friday the 13th movie. This 1972 film is a clear stepping stone between the atmosphere-drenched Hammer movies of the previous decade and the gore-drenched slasher movies of the decade to come. The opening is crazy and energetic and gives you all the promise of a wild ride to come, a promise not necessarily completely fulfilled, but the opening is chock full of blood and nudity, equal opportunity nudity as well, which is a rarity still to this day that makes it noteworthy, almost 50 years after this movie was made. But after such an energetic first act, the story does slowly wind down into lots of ponderous wandering around a fog-bound rocky island, deserted lighthouse above, and the caves below. A sort of exploitation Scooby-Doo without the dog. But to be fair, what a start. A couple of people arrive on Snape Island and discover the aftermath of a series of grisly murders, body pieces lying around. The sole survivor of that attack is taken back to the mainland, post-traumatic, catatonic. The police and a psychologist there trying to unlock her memories of what happened with a regimen of psychoactive drugs and a barrage of sort of flashing disco lights, perversely. So as we follow the team of archaeologists as they set foot and begin to explore Snape Island, in parallel we see her treatment, her memories unlocking, and in flashback we find out what happened to her and her friends when they had previously set foot on the island. So everything is going on all at once, and it's a real rock and roll roller coaster. And if they'd have managed to have kept that up, everyone would have heard of Tower of Evil. And certainly I wouldn't have picked it up for 50p on a chance, and it wouldn't have sat over there on my shelf for ages until I came round to a tea and gave it a spin and thought, you know what? I really quite like this. One of the problems is the script. There is so much front-loaded plot and energy and motion that the second half does suffer by comparison. The script also sets up a load of subplots that essentially go nowhere. The interrogation of the teenage survivor allows the film to jump around in time so that we can watch the two groups on the island in tandem. But once we've seen enough of her memories, her storyline sort of fizzles out and goes nowhere. It gets dropped essentially. When the archaeologists going to find this Phoenician treasure make the discovery that they do, no spoilers, there's no sense of resolution to be had. None of that ties into any of the wider events that have been happening on the island that the film is concerned with. There's also an attempt with the second group to create drama and sexual tension between the members of the archaeology team, but it feels forced. Suffice to say, there are enough intramarital affairs going on in that team that would put Fleetwood Mac to shame, but it seems that it was only all put there so that they could have scenes of them sniping at one another, drama through conflict, and none of it comes through into any of the resolution. You can clearly see influences from filmmakers like Mario Bava, as well as a heavy influence from Italian giallo films of the 70s, which when mixed with a very British horror sensibility makes for quite the little oddity sitting in the history of horror. It has the will to sort of push the boundaries and try and be exploitative and on the cutting edge, whilst at the same time feels reduced and set bound. It's clearly a set. When you see wide shots of the island and the lighthouse, they're clearly models, miniatures. The rocks are clearly set bound, set decoration. So whereas films like Bay of Blood, to which Tower of Evil can align itself through sort of depictions, innovative depictions of graphic violence, things like Bay of Blood, and then latterly, sort of almost a decade later, the Friday the 13th movies and the like, The Burning, they're out there on location. So this weird sort of set feeling, this sort of cheap feeling, a sort of BBC 1970s feeling, Hammer horror feeling, so doesn't make it quite the cutting edge, ultra slick, ultra modern movie that it wants to be, but you can see it pushing in that direction. Certainly, along with the likes of Bay of Blood, this is an archetype of the body count movie that would later sort of evolve into the slasher, which would become a Hollywood staple of the 80s. Between films like Tower of Evil and its more experimental and more artistic, explicit horror films coming from Europe, it's hard not to conclude that the slasher boom was inevitable. On its own merits, Tower of Evil is not a film that I would outright recommend. However, if you're interested in the history and evolution of horror and want to join the dots of how the slasher boom of the late 70s, early 80s started, you could do much worse than checking out this often overlooked little gem. And it is a little footnote reminder that yes, along with films like Deathline and the like, we Brits, we were there, we were knocking at the door, if not kicking it down. We were getting there. The sensibilities that we ascribe either to Italian horror cinema or then later what the Americans picked up and ran with are there here and there, Mark of the Devil and things like that, Blood on Satan's Claw. We have those sensibilities, we never quite stuck the landing, I don't think. So a curiosity and also ran, but one that you can have a lot of fun with, I think. So next on the A to Z of horror, it's going to be all about you, with a film that, between you and me, isn't much of a looker. So join me when we reveal that You is for